how are you?
Very well, thanks.
Also with us, Anne-Elisabeth Moutet of the Sunday Telegraph, Stefan de Vries of the Dutch TV and radio station RTL4, and recent author of...
Onder mijn zolen. Hard to pronounce, Under My Soles, about the Arab Spring, a book. Yeah.
And Fouad Al-Obaid of the Kuwait Times. Welcome to all of you. The World This Week that you can follow on Facebook and also on Twitter, where our handle here is @FrançoisF24. There certainly was a lot of tweeting where I've been this past week. A new, uncertain, violent, and yet sometimes, at times, exhilarating, say the locals themselves, a turn, an unexpected turn, a second unexpected turn for the Arab world's most populous nation. We happened to be in Tahrir Square at the end of last week to film reports in the build-up to the first elections since the fall of Hosni Mubarak, when we saw riot police deploy. This is file footage that you're seeing here from back in January. The riot police this time brutally ousting several hundred of those who'd been injured back at the time. The result, well, you've seen it. You've seen it again this Friday. Tahrir Square at times filled by hundreds of thousands, and you see those images there. You can tell there's a lot of people because it's backed up all the way in the back there towards where the Cairo Antiquities Museum is. And now, this happening despite the fall of one civilian cabinet, but the aging generals in charge are still around. Stefan de Vries, were you expecting this sort of second flare-up? Egyptians don't like it when you say Act Two. For them, it's just an unfinished revolution. But were you expecting things to come to a head like this?
Well, not in this to this extent. Actually, we should not forget it's only 11 months ago that Mohamed Bouazizi in Tunisia set himself on fire. So that's an extremely short period. And in these 11 months, a lot of things have changed already. It's just going not as quickly as we in the West might desire, but this is just, it's part of the revolution. So it's the same revolution that's still going on. And of course, in the wake of the elections next week, it's getting a little bit more intense. And so it's not unexpected. It is, of course, it's quite, it's a good sign that they're still continuing fighting for their rights and still continuing for free Egypt, or a free Egypt in their opinion. So basically, it's basically good news. It doesn't look like it, but it probably is.
Do you agree, Fouad Al-Obaid? Is it good news?
I'm not sure if it's good news. I remember being here early last year and watching the first event unravel while commenting on it. I think it's a positive step. I think, the Arab Street clearly has matured over the past year, and the revolution that went on in practically every single Arab country in a shape, way, or form has empowered the youth to, take an active role in deciding their future, an active role in understanding their rights, their obligations, their liberties also. A lot of them have been influenced by what they see all over the place. There's also, a gap between the old generation, the ruling generation that has ruled for a long period of time, and the growing youth population in a lot of countries. I mean, the pyramid is kind of very flat on the bottom, with a lot of people under the age of 25 and 30 that are seeking a new role in the future of their own country.
Anne-Elisabeth Moutet, when that's a huge point there. The fact that you have, something like 40% of Egypt's population, which is under 30, and
I thought it was even more than that.
And
more like 60 or 70%.
Pretty much.
It's
also,
huge.
it's in the entire Arab world. I mean, a lot of the populations are young and dynamic. A lot of them don't remember what went on in the past. I mean, there's a kind of cleavage of the days where the presidents, they were raised practically with the same people. They've seen their figures all their entire life. And now they see a change, and they want to push the change. They want to see where it can lead.
Anne-Elisabeth, do you see this as a good news story as well, then?
I would like to see it as good news, but I'm not so sure for several reasons. First of all, these young people have been brought up in the last 10, 20 years with an education system that was failing, with a lot of the secular values that used to exist very much in Egypt completely going down by the wayside, with Al-Azhar University in the past 20 years becoming more and more Islamist, and with the frustration that comes from not having jobs, not being able to support themselves girls not even being able to get married because they don't have enough to move from their parents, and with increasing frustration and despair. And I would like to identify this frustration and despair in some of the shady, unpleasant things that have happened recently. You know that a fellow journalist, a woman journalist from France 3, was sexually assaulted on Tahrir Square 1 or 2 days ago. She's the third woman journalist to whom this happens. It's a quasi rape, and she said that it lasted for 45 minutes, and she thought she was going to die. We know about the CBS News reporter a couple of months back, Lara Logan. There's an American Egyptian journalist called Mona Al-Tawi. Yeah. And I think really this is very worrisome. I think the explosion is the explosion of a frustration. There are, of course, good people, but we ought to remember that only 6% of the Egyptian population is connected to the internet. And when we talk about the Twitter and Facebook revolution, it's even less than that, since lots of those people just have an email box to do business. I would like to be optimistic, but I'm not.
Anne Bagger-Murray, your thoughts on this?
Well, one of the elements that occurs to me as we were talking is something we were discussing before the show, and that is the sense that you had when you were there, reporting of an anti-American feeling, an anti-American current that runs underneath all the protests. That I find quite worrisome, because I think that has to be a learned response on the part of this young population. They didn't really live during the period. And frankly, in the beginning, the protests in Tahrir, the revolution in Egypt, we all remarked upon it. It was remarkably secular. It was remarkably non-xenophobic. There were no villains outside the country that anybody was blaming. These were Egyptians wanting control over their own destiny. And now, after X number of months of frustrated ambition and things not moving as quickly, now the search goes on for villains. And I'm disappointed to see that they're looking at the Americans.
Well, we'll get to the
Israelis.
We'll get to the Americans later. The main message, though, was really squarely against the generals. And Fouad Al-Obaid there mentioning the fact that it's a young population. On Tuesday, it was a 76-year-old field marshal that made his first speech since the fall of Hosni Mubarak, Hussein Tantawi, making pledges to go faster.
The armed forces, represented by their Supreme Council, do not aspire to govern and put the supreme interest of the country above all considerations. And it is completely ready to hand over responsibility immediately and to return to its original mission to protect the nation, if the nation wants that, via a popular referendum, if required.
Stefan de Vries, a referendum if required.
Yeah, well, they're learning democracy step by step, and it's a very complicated process. So he's already a very old man, so learning is even more difficult for his age. But it shows how complicated things are, and it's not very easy to say, okay, it's not like a Lego box where we're just putting in some bricks to build a democracy. It's completely new. These people don't have any experience, especially since they're so young and used to the authoritarian regimes. So they have to learn a lot of things.
I spoke to one businessman, Elisabeth Moutet, who said to me, of course, Field Marshal Tantawi was going to make a bad speech. He's not a politician. He's a military man. He's not used to being in the limelight.
I mean, it's worse than that in many ways. First of all, because I think, looking back, there were the makings of a revolution, but what we really had was a military coup. It deposed a president that had basically was past his sell-by date. And then you had the army taking over. And to some extent, you could see the point the army had probably was the most efficient, centralized economic system within Egypt. And so they were possibly armed to make things work, but I'm not sure they have not squandered all this. But look at this man, look at these young people on the square, and look at this man who's like a mummy. He's treated as if he'd sort of walked out of the pyramids, and he's talking in an old language. And I think he is not, of course, he's not getting the point. But it's also emblematic of, I would be a young Egyptian, I'd despair, because I think these are the men who think they can still rule us like before.
Now, that what's interesting is that this is the part of the speech that we in the West picked up on. I don't speak Arabic, but those who do Tuesday mostly remember the tone. Phrases like, this is ruining the economy, it's driving a wedge between the army and the people to destroy the state of Egypt. Protesters furious.
In my opinion, the statement by Tantawi today is a provocation. He's urging some people to oppose the revolutionaries on Tahrir Square as if they were hoodlums, which just isn't true. And what's more, people are expecting a much stronger reaction than this.
If I'd like to comment, I think one of the things that a lot of people are seeing, even with the Arab Spring and what's going on, it's a lot of it is youth-led, and a lot of them are sick and tired of the old status quo. Their parents' generation, they lived a better life than the generation that's living right now. One thing is the numbers. I mean, you just see the population explosion. I mean, you've had this generation has a lot more people than the one before it. The economic situation is harder in a lot of countries, and the wealth is having a hard time trickle down to the bottom level. And even in countries where the wealth is not really an issue, I think dignity and pride and the notion that the youth are connected together, using new mediums such as Twitter and Facebook and whatnot, mediums that the governments don't really understand. I mean, as you clearly said earlier, my colleague, that a lot of them seem to emerge from the tombs or whatever. It's true. I mean, you look at a lot of, the Arab leaders, a lot of them are old, and the cleavage is becoming more and more felt, and one country is helping another country. I mean, I don't think each country is linked together, but I think they get inspiration from one another.
And this is where maybe I'll join Stefan in seeing the glass half full. Ambag Murray, the fact that we see Field Marshal Tantawi in that wide shot on the screen, clearly this is not a man who uses his smartphone.
No, and Egyptian TV probably has a little bit to learn about framing and about lighting and production values. No, it's one of the things that struck me watching the coverage of Tahrir Square this week is the diversity that you saw among the protesters. It isn't just a youth revolution, although Egypt is a young country, as all the Arab countries are, and the youth probably, especially young men, probably have the energy, and some of them have the technical smarts to push this forward. But on Tahrir Square, you had families. You had lots of women. The photographs that we looked in the editorial office just put on our front page, the headscarves, there were more women sometimes than men in the shots that we were looking at. This is an incredibly diverse and broad-based continuation of the revolution. And the fact that the Field Marshal Tantawi and his number two seem to be so detached from what's going on in the streets is profoundly worrying.
Now, time and again, when we approached the front line of the clashes in the side street that leads from Tahrir Square to the Interior Ministry, protesters told me that it was a video posted Monday evening on social networking sites that outraged people more than anything. What appears to be a dead body, certainly someone unconscious, and you can see it, the image is a bit dark, dragged over to the garbage-strewn gutter and left unattended. This image, Fuad Al-Obaid, is the thing that everyone in Egypt was talking about.
It's shocking. A lot of the images, I mean, clearly you mentioned the notion about the media and the cutouts. A lot of these youth are watching modern shows, they're watching European shows, American shows. They're not seeing a government that is seen as active, A lot of them are old, but they actually feel old. They don't only... I mean, media-wise, they're not projecting themselves as people that are in charge. A lot of them are not even coming up to give daily briefs. I mean, there is no notion of chaos, whereas on Twitter, you have a second-by-second episode of what's going on. And these images are very easy to use to enrage a population that's already galvanized.
Stefan de Vries, when you were researching your book, did you feel the same difficulty we did in getting statements from someone from the military? Our local correspondent telling us that for a week, they had a spokesman who spoke to the foreign media, and they quickly stopped.
Yeah, it's very hard to get...
Because we'd like to hear their side of the story.
Reliable sources, because they're simply not used to talking to the media, and it's something they never did, or they just issued statements and it was one direction. So that's very hard indeed to get their side of the story. It's also very hard to speak with the young boys who are also in the army to get their side of the story, because they hardly... speak English. I don't speak Arabic, so that's indeed it's difficult. And even when you're working with fixers, people who will translate what you're doing, it's very hard to know what exactly is going on, because a lot of people in the army do not agree with these actions, but they simply obey, and that's worrisome.
It's a story that's not getting out. I mean, they don't have a lot of them. If you look at the stories that they're giving out, it's almost pathetic to the statement that they're saying. Whether it was in Muammar Gaddafi's era where he's talking about thugs and people on drugs. Bashar al-Assad using similar terms. I mean, there's a clear disconnect between the reality of today, where media is everywhere, and they really don't know how to interact with them.
And yet, and Elisabeth Moutet, the activists, even the ones that are the most hardened against the regime, always clear to make that distinction between the top brass and the rest of the military?
Well, I mean, I'm not sure, but I think there's 500,000 men at least in the Egyptian army about.
Pretty much. Yeah.
And you've got the top brass, and they've got their own shops, and they've got their own houses, and they've got their own personnel, and they live a fairly comfortable life in a country where life can sometimes not be comfortable. And then you've got this great crowd of young conscripts who are not treated very much better than the conscripts in the Napoleon's Great Army. And they are poor, and they are children of the people, and very often they come from the countryside and from the south. And they themselves are basically told, go and do that. And I remember instances that we covered here in France 24, where the young soldiers prevented, they put down their weapons, and they said, no, we're not going to shoot, and they prevented some of the demonstrations to degenerate. So I think the young people are quite aware that the young soldiers are just oppressed as much as they are.
Standing in Tahrir Square Tuesday, amid the biggest turnout since the fall of Hosni Mubarak, with hundreds of thousands pouring in, chanting, rallying, certain side streets, there's tear gas, rubber bullets. This is what was concentrating the minds over in Washington. All right, We'll go to that to that in a moment. What you had was the U.S. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton talking about Iran instead of talking about what was going on in Egypt. People felt a certain amount of disconnect at that point.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is probably a side effect of the fact that the Obama White House has decided to pick its battles. I'm not in the head of Secretary of State Clinton. I do know that Iran is a preoccupation of the United States for a variety of reasons, but it is true that, again, the world is used to America being engaged in any conflict on foreign soil that threatens democracy, et cetera. I mean, America has led the world to believe that, so it's understandable that...
Right, we'll pick up on this point when The World This Week continues. You're watching France 24.